Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is J.M.W Turner and Plato's Cave, the Man with the Golden Sun. His life partook of the character of his works. It was mysterious, and nothing seemed so much to please him as to try and puzzle you or make you think so. For if he began to explain or tell you anything, he was sure to break off in the middle, look very mysterious, nod, and wink his eye, saying to himself, "Make out that if you can." Hi everybody, and as you could see from the thumbnail, there's a bit of a Bond theme today. But ages ago I was watching, what's it called? Skyfall. And there's a whole story behind that which I'll explore in a future video, because I just assumed it was an English word, and it's actually from Swedish, Skyfall. Or I think a proper Swedish pronunciation might be Skyfall. And it means a sudden downpour or a sudden cloud burst. But anyway, that will be for another video on the theme of Turner. But this is one of the images from the film Skyfall, if I can use the English pronunciation. And it's interesting, this is where Bond meets Q, who I'll talk about the significance of Q in relation to this talk as well. But they're looking at this painting, which is by Joseph Mallord William Turner, in case you didn't know what the J.M.W stood for in his initials. And it's called the Fighting Temeraire. And that'll be the focus of today's talk, and I'm going to link it to the concept of Plato's cave. And Plato, for those of you not familiar with his work, I think, as far as philosophy goes, he's relatively accessible, and he's obviously foundational to Western philosophy. So I'll be giving you details about perhaps what you, if you're not used to or you've not encountered Plato in the original, so to speak. I'm assuming you're not speaking ancient Greek, but if you haven't, exposed yourself to I'll rephrase that. If you haven't encountered Plato in a literary sense, then I'll be talking through that before I get taken off YouTube. Hopefully. Shows you where my mind's at. Right, so this is in the National Gallery in London. This is filmed. So I've mentioned the Fighting Temeraire, but also notice the paintings on either side. And I'm sure when I was there, the one on the left, which is called the Evening Star, was on the other side. So they must obviously switch them around in the gallery. But on the right-hand side, this is a painting called, I'm just going through them because I'd like to do a series where I look at this and the Evening Star as well. But this is called Rain, Steam and Speed from 1844. And it's interesting because it's a brilliant painting of the power of the steam train as it was emerging as a new technology. And this was a line connecting Maidenhead and Tuplow in the south of England. And it's hilarious because it just, the train system conquered the globe. But, Maidenhead and Tuplow, it just sounds so prosaic. That's a bit of a closer look. Beautiful painting. Like I say, I'll do a whole talk on this. So don't feel like, hopefully you won't feel like I'm shortchanging you by just giving you a tease now. But this is the other one on the left-hand side that you've just seen where Bond is talking to Q. And this is the Evening Star, circa 1830. And it's not easy to make out, which I'll talk about because I think Turner deliberately can be quite obscure, as the epigraph at the beginning of this talk suggested. Clarity was not something he sought, which can be opposed to what Plato was arguably describing in his work. But this is a closer up view of it. And I came across this quote It wasn't published in his lifetime, I don't think, but I think it was a quote published in 1806 by Newton, Isaac Newton, and he was talking about his own scientific endeavour. And Sir Isaac Newton said, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." Which I think is just a great a quote to accompany this painting by Turner. But back to Bond and Skyfall. So he's looking intently at the Fighting Temeraire, and in the background, I'll mention them in a second, but you've got on the left a painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, and on the right there's a Gainsborough. And this is when Q comes on the scene. And you can see in more detail the paintings behind them. So just for the sake of completeness, I don't think it's a massively interesting painting. No offence, Mr. Gainsborough. But this is Mr. and Mrs. William Hallett from 1785. So that was on the right-hand side of that picture from the film. And I did a whole video on this, so if you haven't seen it and you're interested in this painting, I suggest you go back 2 or 3 videos. It's an experiment on a bird in an air pump, 1768, by Joseph Wright of Derby. But this is the one I really wanted to talk about. This is what he's focused on, and it's quite emblematic because when he and Q start discussing it, when you've seen the previous picture of Q sat on the bench with him, Q represents technology. Q is the guy with all the gadgets, and he says, forgive me, it's ages since I saw the film, but there's a dialogue between them, and it's along the lines of Bond makes fun of Q for being so young. I mean, I think he makes a joke about his complexion. He still has spots, and Q says, "I may be young, but I can do more harm still in my pajamas on my computer in the morning before I've had my breakfast than you can out in the field." And then Bond responds by saying something along the lines of, "Yeah, but you don't know when the trigger needs pulling to do that. You have to be out in the field." And there's this question of abstract control, and this is relevant to Plato as we go along. Abstract control, trying to have a scientific understanding of the world, versus boots on the ground, being actively involved, having direct physical experience of what's going on. And in some ways, that's what the film represents in that particular scene. And the actual painting, it's interesting because the Temeraire is this, if you actually, when you first look at it, and I don't want to prejudice your first impressions, so by all means have a good look, but I think the ship in the background, which is the Temeraire, it was a key battleship, I think, in the Battle of Trafalgar, and it took a massive part in the battle and helped protect Nelson. And it's being pulled by a tug. And on the one hand, it's quite a realistic painting, so it's not abstract, it's not it is figurative, it's not, it's quite realistic. The sunset's very dramatic, but, that's recognisably reality from with a bit of poetic painter's license. But if you look more closely, the ship's quite spectral. I did a video ages ago, The Ancient Mariner, and it reminds me of the ship as it's floating through the Arctic water. It's quite ghostly. And there are certain unrealistic aspects. So there's a tug at the front, but it would need another tug that would need to be behind, and you obviously can't see it. But Turner, has painted it so that the second tug isn't significant at all. the masts wouldn't have been up because at this point it had been sold for scrap by the Royal Navy, and this is the ship basically being taken off to the knacker's yard. So it represents loads of things: the rise of new steam power, the tug pulling it, the death of a certain previous age, the fighting age of the sailing ship and the Great Royal Navy, which is quite topical today. Talk about going to the knacker's yard. We can't get one ship off to the Mediterranean at a time of war, but I fear I might digress. But it's the masts would have been, like I say, taken down because the whole ship was taken apart. Well, just before it got taken off to the absolute knacker's yard, the Royal Navy took as much from the core of the ship as they possibly could to recycle it. So the masts, the rigging, all of that stuff would have been gone, and then it was disassembled. So this is the end of an era, and there's the obvious parallel with Bond as well. The sun setting, obviously, end of an era. I don't think I mentioned, I think it was first exhibited in 1839, just to give you some context time-wise. If you notice on the left, there's the moon and the reflection of the moon in the water, which is a common motif in Turner's work, which you'll see as we go along with other visual examples. But in terms of the man with the golden sun, I'm going to explore Turner's portrayal of the sun and use it to illustrate, literally and metaphorically, Plato's notion of the sun, and how in turn Plato used the sun as a simile for the pursuit of true knowledge. And this is the same image. I've played around with the exposure on some of these just to give you a sense, different light conditions, and also to see the underlying use of light in the painting. It's like a fretted canopy of sky. And then I want to develop the Bond theme in future videos, so it struck me that paintings like this, just to give a contrast, this is Moonlight, a study at Millbank from 1797. So I might do a video called Moonraker. This is closer. And Bond does lend itself. So for your eyes only, I'm thinking of other art relevant. I might do a video called J.M.W Turner, License to Thrill. See what I did there? But this is just a contrast with the concept of the sun, his pursuit of moonlight, which we'll be talking about Plato's cave and shadows. So this is relevant. But just to give you an example of the range of Turner, I think he's an absolutely, truly fascinating painter. And to give you a sample of how abstract his work could be, this was from circa 1830. And he had various sketchbooks and, exploratory watercolours and obviously not fully developed paintings. But even so, this was Boats at Sea, 1830. It's just so far ahead of his time. The title of this was A Wreck, possibly, I'm just reading out the title now, A Wreck, possibly related to Longship's lighthouse, Land's End. That's circa 1834. So I think this was a study he did, just called A Wreck. And there was another painting, Longship's Lighthouse, Land's End, 1834, that it could have been related to. And then I absolutely love this one. This was one of his colour studies. It's referred to as Colour Beginning from 1819. And it's so abstract, but I could imagine being on a beach and seeing that misty scene. Be before the sand began to annoy me, and I can't stand salt water. But for a moment, I'd find this quite nice. The seagulls bothering you, squawking away. People in ill-fitting swimming trunks. Anyway, I'm distracting myself again. But just by way of contrast, this is Monk by the Sea by Caspar David Friedrich, and they reckon it was 1808 to 1810. And what I want to point out here is it's relatively abstract portrayal of nature using it as a background, but there's a definite, you can't see the monk clearly, but there's, an obvious definite figure of the monk, and bear this in mind as I show you more examples from Turner and how the human figure isn't as well defined. So this is an even more obvious example from Caspar David Friedrich, A Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. So there's a slightly abstract, misty atmosphere to nature that's being portrayed, but the human figure is obviously standing there erect and proud, so to speak. And then compare and contrast that with Turner, the way he depicts people in relation to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere, without wishing to sound like Russ Abbott, the atmosphere I'll talk about towards the end of the talk, and how it's crucial to Turner in contrast to Plato. So this is called Venetian Scene from 1840 to 1845. And I'm just trying to make the point about how there's actual, this is Venice and this is people in the foreground, but you'd need to be told that it really isn't obvious. It's all about the light effects. And as we go along, I'm going to be exploring how Plato associated or used as a simile the concept of the sun as representative of the true form of knowledge and truth itself. And yet you can see right from the get-go, hopefully, in Turner, light it illuminates, but it doesn't reveal. In fact, it does the opposite. It can be seen as confusing. So this is called The Arrival of Louis Philippe at the Royal Clarence Yard, Gosport, 8th of October, 1844. A snappy title. But again, you see the figures in the foreground. If you look closely, you can work out they're actually people, but everything blends, and the light is used to blend everything together in one atmospheric aspect. An aspect is a word I'll be picking up on. And this is it's an excuse to show you just amazing Turner paintings, but this is Approach to Venice, 1844. And this is just a detail. Because I'll be picking up on the use of colour as well. Just the little dabs of red. And like I say, I don't mean to be enigmatic, but I'll be talking about his use of red later on. So these were just all context-providing examples of Turner's art, how he uses light. I've introduced just with this detail how he uses colour, which is a huge topic in and of itself. I think the talk that I'll try and explore Turner's use of colour specifically could be related to the Bond title, The Living Daylights. It gets quite addictive just using Bond titles. Once is not enough, to paraphrase. Right, so on to Plato. This is his famous Allegory of the Cave, which is Book 7 of Plato's Republic. And I'm going to be quoting from Book 6 and 7 because people tend to be familiar with this allegory. but it was part of, it was the thing from in order, it was the third of simile. There's the simile of the sun, the simile of the divided line, and then there's the simile of the cave, or the allegory of the cave. And the basic idea is, as you can see, he uses the idea that the human condition is like people chained at the back of a cave, and what they're actually seeing, they think is reality, are shadows on a wall. And if you escape the cave, you can go out into the bright sunlight. Problem being, and this is why I think Plato is often misunderstood, there's some quite clever ironies in how he's writing. You go from a dark cave out into the bright sunlight, and you just basically burn your retinas off. So one question I'd ask you to think about all the way through the rest of the talk is the extent to which Plato is being ironic. And I think personally, and it's all subjective to some extent because there's such a long period of time since he wrote, over just over 2,300 years, the extent to which he should be taken literally, the extent to which he was using poetic techniques in his work while simultaneously purportedly criticizing poetry. There's a certain performative contradiction in his work that I don't think people pick up on. And what I'll be claiming as we go along is that even if Plato meant every word he said, which I don't think he did, I think he was being ironic, even though I do tend to see sarcasm and irony everywhere. Even if he wasn't, you could read him against himself, because as I'll explain at the end of the talk, his own personal attempt to use his concept of the Republic, this perfect form of government, he tried it in Sicily at Syracuse and failed miserably. So his work could be seen, even if he was being totally literal and serious, which I don't think he was, but even if he was, his own work could be read against himself as a glorious failure. He pushed how far you could take abstract ideas and inadvertently proved how pure abstract ideas don't work in the real world. So this is, I won't spend a lot of time on this because, again, it's a video in and of itself, but this is the concept of Plato's idea of ideal forms. So at the top is, according to Plato, what philosophical reasoning striving for. Noesis, this intelligence, or the dialectic, the most profound form of pure understanding and truth. Mathematical reasoning's just below it, then you have belief, and at the bottom, and this is what's interesting with relation to Turner, illusion or imagining, shadows and images. So at the top is the type of reasoning that underlies bureaucracy, technocracy, a technological approach to the world that dominates today. And at the bottom is the much more impressionistic and, yes, propaganda, people's false beliefs in sections A and B, but also art, poetry, all the stuff that's on this channel that I think is important. And like I say, if you read Plato in a too simplistic way, you could see him advocating this model without any sense of irony, arguing that this is the true hierarchy of knowledge. And I'm going to question that and say it just doesn't work if it's interpreted too literally. So this is a comparison of the divided line idea. Just it's inverted, but it's compared to the cave. So this time going down from A to D is the path that Plato is exploring in the Republic. So in some metaphorical sense, Plato wants to train us to look directly at the sun, eventually, trying to climatize our eyes to it. And what I'm suggesting is that Turner and Plato, in some ways, if you, when I say Plato, if you interpret Plato literally and really advocating this model, which I don't think he did, I think it's much more complex than that. But let's just say Plato is using this as his ideal model. He's advocating in those terms knowledge of the form of the good, whereas Turner is exploring the world of illusion and representation. And you can further complicate that by the very fact that Turner was doing this in such a clever way and knowingly. I think that helps the concept of understanding how true human knowledge involves the tension between all these different forms of knowledge. And a good artist recognizes that. So a good artist like Turner just didn't paint, as I'll show you in a second, constant examples of the sun. There were variations. Moonlight, sunset, sunrise, bright sun, being blinded by the sun, all of these things Turner engaged with. But anyway, I was going to suggest if you want to look at the Republic of Plato, and I might dragoon poor Stuart into doing this at some point in the future, in about 20 years when we finish Proust. But if you want to have a look, if you can get hold, this is my personal recommendation for the edition that you should try and get hold of, Alan Bloom's translation. What do I know? Because I've got no ancient Greek knowledge, but the actual translation, there are other translations that maybe flow a bit better, but I think the tone that Alan Bloom went for is he tries to bring out the conversational element of the dialogues, which I think he succeeds in. But irrespective, I encourage you to look at as many different translations as you can to get a different flavour of how it could be interpreted. But at the end of this, he does what he calls an interpretive essay, where he systematically goes through every section of the Republic and gives a running commentary that I think is worth buying the book just for that. It's a really good essay. So that's my recommendation if you want to. It's a good starting point to read Plato. And then if that takes your fancy, if you really like that, this is my recommendation for the complete works. It's a brilliant, it's like tissue paper, because otherwise it would just be ridiculously big. It's a large tome as it is. But if you can get hold of this, if you're on a budget, it's not cheap, so try and get a second-hand copy. I think brand new, it's about $65 US, and it's about £55 sterling. But it's brilliant, it really is. And I honestly think Plato's a lot more accessible than people think he is. So I don't do book lists. I've joked with someone in the comment section. I don't understand the whole fetish. Well, I do understand it's a fetish, but people just want lists of things. But occasionally I do like to recommend, if you're going to pursue a certain thinker, there are certain editions you should maybe look out for. So, moving on into the realm of Plato, and now I'm going to try and combine the Plato and the Turner. So what I'll do is, when I engage directly with Plato's text, I'm going to show images of Turner. And as ever on this channel, I hope that will break up the monotony of my drony Mardy Ringo Starr voice. But before I do that, just some quick background. This is not that this is particularly significant, the painting itself, it's what it depicts better. This is Jacques Gamelin, 18th century. But what it depicts is what interests me. In opposition to Plato, you have this guy, ill-dressed guy, sitting on the ground on the right, and that's Diogenes of Sinope. He was the founder of, or he was one of, what we've come to know as the Cynic philosophy, which obviously gives rise to the modern word cynicism. But in ancient Greece, they were the Cynics, which I'll explain that, the origins, the etymology. But on the left, you have Alexander the Great. And what I love about Diogenes, more than one video you could just spend on Diogenes. But in this particular instance, he has all these one-liners. But in this instance, the most powerful man on earth, Alexander the Great, come to see him, and he's living like a bit of a tramp. And Alexander the Great, to repeat, the most powerful man on earth, says, Diogenes, what can I do for you? And Diogenes says, you can get out of my sunlight. And like I say, there are many examples of witty one-liners. Now, there's also, I'm just going to now dive into some other context. There's a Diogenes Laertius, who was a historian and biographer. So it's not this Diogenes, but just to make things complicated, Diogenes Laertius wrote a history of the ancient philosophers, including Diogenes of Sinope. So Diogenes Laertius relates many encounters between the two. In his history of Diogenes of Sinope, two of which deal specifically with Syracuse and Plato's actions there, they reveal much about their ideological differences. So the story here is, I alluded to it earlier on, Plato, towards the end of his life, went to... Socrates had been killed for allegedly... what was it? Perverting the youth. I'm trying to remember the precise wording of the charge. Corrupting the youth of Athens. And he refused to escape. He had the chance to escape, but thought he'd die for his principles, so he took the hemlock. So Plato's angry about what the democratic Athens did to his mentor. So he's looking for reasons to get out of town, I suppose. And he went off to Syracuse in Sicily. And it's a long story which I won't bore you with, but there were two tyrants, one after the other. Dionysius the first and Dionysius the second, and he had a friend, Dion, and this is complicated because the scholars debate whether Plato and Dion were lovers, but they were very close friends, let's put it that way. And upon Dion's request or invitation, Plato goes off to Syracuse and tries to enact his political philosophy with these dictators, Dionysius the first and then later the second, and it just fails miserably. But just to give an example of the difference, so Plato is this abstract, trying to apply abstract models, and Diogenes is much more practical and cynical. So in the first encounter, Plato saw Diogenes washing lettuces and said to him, had you paid court to Dionysius, you wouldn't now be washing lettuces. Diogenes replied, if you had washed lettuces, you wouldn't have paid court to Dionysius. Because in ancient Athens, the idea that you were beholden to someone, which Plato was to Dionysius, that was reflected badly upon your character. So another example, this is Gaspare Diziani from the 18th century. And then another bit of dialogue from Diogenes to Plato. Observing Plato one day at a costly banquet taking olives. How is it, he said, that you, the philosopher who sailed to Sicily for the sake of these dishes, now when they are before you, do not enjoy them? Nay, by the gods, Diogenes, replied Plato, there also for the most part I lived among olives and such like. Why then, said Diogenes, did you need to go to Syracuse? Was it that Attica at the time did not grow olives? So it's seemingly, a bit of a boring chat about olives, but actually I think it's quite revealing about the nature of human desire. So why did he go all the way to Syracuse when he's in Syracuse? It's this thing about desire. You end up missing what you could have had. And the minute you think you've got everything, you just miss the simple things you used to have. So he's gone all the way to Syracuse and he's got these, incredibly rich banquets in front of him, and he ends up eating the simple thing that reminds him of home. Which then begs the question, Diogenes is being mean, but why did you go in the first place if you ended up just eating what you could have had for free at home? So behind that is quite an interesting insight into human psychology. But one of the aspects of this failed political experiment, and I won't go into a lot of detail because I don't want to just overly simplify it and maybe at a future date. Because, for example, just to give you an example of how complicated it is, there are various letters that are attributed to Plato, and it's the seventh letter where Plato, and this is what scholars dispute whether it actually was him, but of all the letters, they think it's most likely the seventh letter was from Plato. And in the seventh letter, he gives this account of his adventures in Syracuse and why they failed. And for such a brilliant thinker, it's quite funny. He basically blames Dion, Dionysius the first and second. He blames everyone but himself, and he basically blames the people of Syracuse of not being worthy of him. And it just reminded me, there was Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright. He wrote a poem called The Solution, and one of the lines is, it was about, there was an uprising in East Germany in 1953. So he was making a parody or satirizing the response of the communist authorities. And he said in this poem, The Solution, would it not in that case be simpler for the government, because they've rebelled, that is. So I'll read it again. The people have rebelled, and this is Bertolt Brecht's satire called The Solution, inverted commas. Would it not in that case be simpler for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? Which increasingly seems to be a value in democracies. If you don't get your way in a vote, we'll just keep asking for another vote. But this is another representation of this Diogenes scene. I think this is at the Louvre. Pierre Puget, circa 1680. And is it just me? Or if you look at Alexander the Great on the horse, that must be the most camp portrayal of Alexander the Great in artistic history. And another funny, this is building upon the notion of the etymology I mentioned of the cynic. So this is Edwin Landseer from 1848. And our modern notion of the word cynic comes from there's a Greek adjective which is kunikos, which means dog-like. And that's the Greek noun for dog is kuon. God knows if I'm pronouncing it properly. So this is where they've always associated the cynics, the kynics, with the concept of God, gods. That's a Freudian reversal with dogs. But actually, I think there's an area called Kynosarges, an area of Athens, where the school of Diogenes and company was. So I think originally that's why they were called the Kynos or the cynics. But it got associated with the Greek word for dog. So this was just Edwin Landseer's little joke. His representation of Alexander meeting Diogenes in the barrel where Diogenes lived. It's like the philosophical version of, those paintings of dogs playing pool or playing poker. Right, so now we're diving into Turner to make some links with Plato. So this is called, this isn't Turner, this is a painter called, known as Claude, famous French painter. And this is Seaport with the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba from 1648. And why I'm showing it is this Turner famously saw this and purportedly burst into tears because he said, I'll never paint anything that good. But notice the portrayal of the sun. And then this was Turner's painting, heavily influenced by the previous one, and this is called Dido Building Carthage, or The Rise of the Carthaginian Empire from 1815. And from memory, apologies if I've misremembered, I think Turner gifted this painting, and the condition was that it was hung next to the previous one by Claude. So it just shows you how much Turner was influenced by the previous painting. Just to show you again. This is seaport with the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba, 1648. Dido building Carthage at the rise of the Carthaginian Empire, 1815. And this was another one, the decline by Turner, the decline of the Carthaginian Empire, 1817. And the description that goes with it, Rome, being determined on the overthrow of her hated rival, demanded from her such terms as might either force her into war or ruin her by compliance. The enervated Carthaginians, in their anxiety for peace, consented to give up even their arms and their children. So this is, relatively early, 1817 in Turner's career, but you can begin to see, if you compare it to the previous painting and the previous painting again, you can see the way the sun, that we're going to talk about the man with the golden sun, this becomes more similar to the sun depicted in the Fighting Temeraire. And I'm showing examples because we're going to talk very shortly about Plato's use of the notion, the simile of the sun. But also it shouldn't be forgotten that Turner, and this is what I'll do in future videos on Turner, I want to look at the way in which the sun is depicted at the end of the day, the sunfall, if not Skyfall. But this is known as Stafford Fingal's Cave, 1831 to 2. And I'll talk, there's so much to talk about, but basically there's the atmospheric, there's the power of nature and how it threatens human beings and how human beings are part of it. But for the purposes of this talk, I just wanted to focus on the way Turner deals with the sun. Because Plato talks about the concept of, eventually uses the comparison of being able to look directly into the sun being a representative of the ultimate form of good. But Turner, as I'm pointing out here, was also interested in the sun, not at its brightest, in a more complex way as the sun's going down. And this is another example, Calais Sands at low water, Poissards collecting bait from 1830. So what I'm going to do now is, prior to the Allegory of the Cave, which is in Book 7 of the Republic, there is this discussion of the simile of the divided line, but then there's the discussion of the notion of the sun. So in Book 6, and it just interests me because most people know about the Allegory of the Cave, but they don't know the full context. So I've talked about the dividing of the line, or the divided line, sorry. But now I want to talk about the concept of the simile of the sun. So just to reiterate, there are three main similes. The Allegory of the Cave is the final one, but there's also the simile of the divided line, the simile of the sun, and then the cave. So this is a dialogue that goes on between Socrates and Glaucon is the elder brother of Plato. So these are the two people speaking in the next section. So I is Socrates. Have you, I said, and the other person is Glaucon, have you, I said, reflected on how lavish the craftsman of the senses was in the fabrication of the power of seeing and being seen? Not very much, he said. Well, consider it in this way. Is there a need for another class of thing in addition to hearing and sound, in order that the one hear and the other be heard? A third thing, in the absence of which the one won't hear and the other won't be heard? No, he said. I suppose, I said, that there are not many other things, not to say none, that need anything of the kind, or can you tell of any? Not I, he said. Don't you notice that the power of seeing and what's seen do have such a need? How? A couple of quick things to say before we move on with the dialogue. One is, it amuses me because this idea of the Socratic dialogue, and it's one of the pieces of evidence I'd offer to say that Plato had a sense of irony. He's presenting things as a discussion in order to generate the truth, but it's obviously staged for dramatic effect. And I'm trying not to read Glaucon's responses sarcastically, but it's obviously manufactured and set up. It's being used as almost a fictional device. So it goes back to this idea. Later on in the Republic, Plato talks about, the ideal republic would require banning poetry, sending children off to be part of like communist type units without their parents, and all these, I would suggest, ridiculous things that are Plato's thought experiment taken to the nth degree. But people, Karl Popper famously in a book called Democracy, Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl Popper basically accused Plato of being a totalitarian nutter. And I just think he's missed the point. So that's the first thing. There's an irony built in. There's dramatic effect. The second thing is what Plato's doing here is beginning to discuss what is needed in order for people to see. So he starts to talk about this. This is what he's getting at. The idea that there's a, rather than sound, which is just heard or not heard, vision requires this atmosphere of eyes that can see, but also an atmosphere with sufficient light. And this question of atmosphere and the surrounding medium of how we see, I think that's Plato. So superficially he's talking about how can we just see the most brightest sun as an emblem of the truth, when in instances like this, and we're going to see it in the next few slides, he's actually much more sensitive to the complexity of sight. And I don't think he's given enough credit for that. And in terms of atmosphere, how we see the medium, the aspect of sight, Turner engages with that directly. So appropriately enough for a talk called The Man with the Golden Gun, this is called Goldau from 1843, Goldau. It's in Switzerland, I think. It had been the site of a rock fall in 1806. So the boulders in the foreground are part of that. But look at the lighting, the atmosphere, the sun in the back. And this is just a different exposure. So to continue with the dialogue, surely, Socrates speaking, surely when sight is in the eyes and the man possessing them tries to make use of it, and colour is present in what is to be seen, in the absence of a third class of thing whose nature is specifically directed to this very purpose, you know that the sight will see nothing and the colours will be unseen. So Glaucon says, what class of thing are you speaking of? He said. It's that which you call light, I said. What you say is true, he said. It's convenient, isn't it? But this thing about light, this medium, the atmosphere through which we see, is to, heavily underline my point, is what I'm claiming Turner is all about. This is the son of Venice going to sea, 1843. And the sun is even, you can see it through the sail. Well, this is I'm just, as I'm speaking, what a stupid thing to say. That's a symbol on the sail. I would have thought, am I being stupid? But the interesting thing is, it could be behind, you could be seeing the sun through the sail. But the fact it's called the Son of Venice going to sea makes you think it's the name of the ship and it's on the sail. Apologies, I should have looked into that more before I used it as an example and then started to say stupid things. But it's an interesting visual pun, isn't it? The idea that whatever's true, it's can be interpreted as the image on the sail and the sun coming through the sail. So it's almost like Turner's commenting upon the matching of the image and the representation of the thing itself. So neither sight itself nor that in which it comes to be, what we call the eye, is the sun. Surely not. But I suppose it is the most sun-like of the organs of the senses. Yes, by far. Doesn't it get the power it has as a sort of overflow from the sun's treasury? Most certainly. And the sun isn't sight either, is it? But as its cause is seen by sight itself. That's so, he said. Well then, I said, say that the sun is the offspring of an offspring, the good begot in a proportion with itself, as good is in the intelligible region with respect to intelligence what is intellected. So the sun is in the visible region with respect to sight and what is seen. So he's making this correlation with the sun allowing us to see and the concept of what is intellected, the ultimate form of knowledge and the truth. And I mentioned earlier the idea if you leave the cave, you risk being blinded by the sun. This is a painting Turner did called Regulus, which was 1828 and it was reworked in 1837. But the background story is fascinating because it was a consul defeated and captured at Tunis in 255 BC. So he was sent to Rome to negotiate peace. He urged the Roman Senate to refuse the offer of the Carthaginians, but he failed. So the Carthaginians took revenge on him. They tortured him to death. They removed his eyelids and he was forced to stare into the sun until he became blind. So this is an historical painting, but it has deep relevance to this Platonic idea of the ultimate good and looking directly at the sun. And this is a higher exposure version, just to give you the effect. I suppose you'll say the sun not only provides what is seen with the power of being seen, but also with generation, growth, and nourishment, although it itself isn't generation. Of course. Therefore, say that not only being known is present in the things known as a consequence of the good, but also existence and being are in them, besides as a result of it, although the good isn't being, but is still beyond being, exceeding it in dignity and power. And Glaucon quite ridiculously said, Apollo, what a demonic excess. And this has profound consequences. I won't bore you to death with philosophical interpretations of Plato, but I do find this particular section interesting because of the notion of what is inherent in being. Almost there is something in being that's more than being, exceeding it in dignity and power. And it's just a beautiful phrase, what a demonic excess. And talking of demonic excess, this is called by Turner circa 1845, Sunrise with Sea Monsters. It's just different exposure again. And this is illustrates obviously the theme of the sun and the excess, the demonic excess, but also just the vagueness. What a weird creature. And yes, before you say it, that is similar to what I see in the mirror every morning. So, next, that was book 6. I've shown you, I won't give you the Plato's description of the prisoners in the cave, but I've already shown you the picture of it. But this follows on immediately afterwards. So Socrates is talking to Glaucon again about the 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 prisoners who may escape, who manage to escape from the cave. So now consider, I said, what their release and healing from bonds and folly would be like if something of this sort were by nature to happen to them. Take a man who is released and suddenly compelled to stand up, to turn his neck around, to walk and look up toward the light, and who, moreover, in doing all of this is in pain, and because he is dazzled, is unable to make out those things whose shadows he saw before. What do you suppose he'd say if someone were to tell him that before he saw silly nothings, while now, because he is somewhat nearer to what is and more turned toward beings, he sees more correctly, and in particular, showing him each of the things that pass by, were to compel the man to answer his questions about what they are? Don't you suppose he'd be at a loss and believe that what was seen before is truer than what is now shown? Yes, he said, by far. So this concept of the relativity of truth, you can be shown what, according to Plato, is much closer to the true form of knowledge, but because you're used to illusion, because you're used to the shadows, it's too bright, it's too close to the truth, and you can't deal with it. But again, purportedly, this is Plato arguing for the belief in the true form of knowledge, the true form of truth. I just really do think that underneath all this, there's a sophisticated understanding that it's not realistic, and that life is along that divided line. We're constantly going up and down it, and we exist in the shadows, we interact with the shadows and illusion, as well as striving for the truth. This is called Yacht Approaching the Coast, circa 1840 to 1845. And if he compelled him to look at the light itself, would his eyes hurt? And would he flee, turning away to those things that he is able to make out and hold them to be really clearer than what is being shown? So he would, he said. And if, I said, someone dragged him away from there by force along the rough, steep, upward way, and didn't let him go before he had dragged him out into the light of the sun, wouldn't he be distressed and annoyed at being so dragged? And when he came to the light, wouldn't he have his eyes full of its beam and be unable to see even one of the things now said to be true? No, he wouldn't, he said, at least not right away. This is Brighton from the Sea, circa 1829. And the point I'm making with this, immediately after the previous quote, is this is how we actually can, through art, look at the sun indirectly. And it's the use of yellow here. And when I look at the Living Daylights version, Turner's use of colour, I think there was a contemporary of Turner who accused him of, used the analogy of Turner turns everything into curry, because he liked the colour yellow so much, which I thought was vaguely funny. Then I suppose he'd have to get accustomed, if he were going to see what's up above. At first he'd most easily make out the shadows, and after that the phantoms of the human beings and the other things in water, and later the things themselves, and from there he could turn to beholding the things in heaven and heaven itself more easily, at night looking at the light of the stars and the moon, than by day looking at the sun and sunlight. Of course. Then finally I suppose he would be able to make out the sun, not its appearances in water or some alien place, but the sun itself by itself, in its own region, and see what it's like. Necessarily, he said. So this is a more direct look at the sun. The Chain Pier, Brighton, 1828. And after that, he would already be in a position to conclude about it that this is the source of the seasons and the years, and is the steward of all things in the visible place, and is in a certain way the cause of all those things he and his companions had been seeing. It's plain, he said, that this would be his next step. What then? When he recalled his first home and the wisdom there and his fellow prisoners in that time, don't you suppose he would consider himself happy for the change and pity the others? Quite so. So this is the concept of, once you do get access to the so-called pure truth, how do you then relate, A, to your previous experience being in ignorance, and B, to other people who are still in that level of ignorance? And again, this is the concept of irony. Don't you suppose he would consider himself happy for the change and pity the others? I'm not sure. Being wiser or having much more access to the so-called pure truth makes people happy. And I think, and I'm sure Plato's aware of this, I'm sure there were people, so I don't want to question how happy Diogenes was, but there are people who are ignorant of the truth as Plato saw it, who are unworried by all the things that overthinking people get worried by. So the rhetorical argument he's presenting here, I think Plato is bright enough to know there are other perspectives on this. I'm a massive dog lover, as I've said before, but I do, this is a really poignant painting because it's called Dawn After the Wreck from 1841. So a ship's gone down and it seems to be only a dog survived. Or perhaps it was a dog waiting on the shore loyally, now howling that his master is deep, deep beneath the sea. And just to forewarn you about the treatment of red later on, if you look at the red in the sky there. But the colour is the red, the yellow, the blue, back to yellow and gold and red and all mixed, layered and mixed at the same time. Now reflect on this too, I said. If such a man were to come down again and sit in the same seat, on coming suddenly from the sun, wouldn't his eyes get infected with darkness? Very much so, he said. And if once more had to compete with those perpetual prisoners in forming judgments about those shadows while his vision was still dim, before his eyes had recovered, and if the time needed for getting accustomed were not at all short, wouldn't he be the source of laughter, or wouldn't it be said of him that he went up and came back with his eyes corrupted, and that it's not even worth trying to go up? And if they were somehow able to get their hands on and kill the man who attempts to release and lead up, wouldn't they kill him? No doubt about it, he said. And again, mate, I've said I see dark humour everywhere, but the idea, I think Plato's having a bit of a giggle here. The idea that you make all that effort to see the truth in its pure form, and you go down to tell people, and all they want to do is kill you for the effort. This is Norham Castle Sunrise from 1845. I love this little detail of the cow. It's so simply done, inverted commas simply, like I couldn't do that in a million years, but with minimum brushstrokes, maximum effect. Well then, my dear Glaucon, I said, this image as a whole must be connected with what was said before, like the domain revealed through sight to the prison home, and the light of the fire in it to the sun's power, and in applying the going up and the seeing of what's above to the soul's journey up to the intelligible place, you'll not mistake my expectation, since you desire to hear it. A God doubtless knows if it happens to be true. At all events, this is the way the phenomena look to me. In the knowable, the last thing to be seen, and that with considerable effort, is the idea of the good. But once seen, it must be concluded that this is in fact the cause of all that is right and fair in everything. In the visible it gave birth to light, and its sovereign. In the intelligible, itself sovereign, it provided truth and intelligence, and that the man who is going to act prudently in private or in public must see it. And again, I just think there's a contained irony there that this could describe, depending on the context, the idea that ideologues, people who think they have access to the ultimate truth, this is the truth that they hold, that they then browbeat everyone else with. And for certain ideologues, leads eventually to the death camps and God knows what, labour camps, Colima, and all of that stuff. This is called Mortlake Terrace from 1827. And I love this painting in the sense it's not the most dramatic Turner ever did, but in terms of, again, to paraphrase Russ Abbott, the atmosphere, it's not even purely, there's a hint of mist on the left in the distance, but it's almost like painting the medium of air. I said we must hold the following about these things. Education is not what the professions of certain men assert it to be. They presumably assert that they put into the soul knowledge that isn't in it, as though they were putting sight into blind eyes. Yes, he said, they do indeed assert that. But the present argument, on the other hand, I said, indicates that this power is in the soul of each, and that the instrument with which each learns, just as an eye is not able to turn toward the light from the dark without the whole body, must be turned around from that which is coming into being together with the whole soul, until it is able to endure looking at that which is, and the brightest part of that which is. And we affirm that this is the good, don't we? Yes. And talking about, where was it? He mentioned the eye, just as an eye is not able to turn toward the light from the dark, which is relevant here. This is paintings called Ulysses deriding Polyphemus, Homer's Odyssey, and it's from 1829. So for those not familiar with it, Ulysses or Odysseus, he's trapped the Cyclops. Polyphemus captures him and his men and starts eating them. And Ulysses escapes, or Odysseus escapes, by the guy, and the Cyclops Polyphemus says, I'll eat you last if you tell me your name. So he says, my name is No Man, or Nobody. And then he pokes out, he gets a big stake and stabs Polyphemus in the eye, and his one eye, and blinds him. And Polyphemus shouts out to the other Cyclops, help me, no man is harming me. And they just think the gods are punishing him because he says no man, so they don't come and help him, and Odysseus stroke Ulysses escapes. So that's the background. It's a bit of a closer, but this goes directly, the subject matter of the painting goes towards the concept of sight, but also earlier this issue about the very beginning of this talk, that the epigraph where Turner isn't clear and never really wanted to be clear. That's the story that this is all about. But where is Polyphemus in this? And it's supposed to be in the cloud. You can just make out a head to the left of the sail, but it's not easy to make it out. And if you'll forgive me, it just amuses me talking about Cyclops, because when I was at university doing my PhD, I played in a university game. And the referee was retired, but he'd refereed the first game of, there's a Liverpool player, Graham Souness, one of the best Liverpool players there's ever been. And he, once he'd left Liverpool, he went to be player manager of Rangers in Scotland. And in his first game, I think it was, as player manager, he got sent off. And the referee who sent him off was retired. And he was refereeing this low-level university game I was playing in. And he made a terrible decision. And I said to him, if you had one more eye, you'd be a Cyclops. And he gave me a yellow card. And I was itching. I was very tempted to try and get another yellow card so I could claim I got sent off by the same referee who sent Graham Souness off. So that's my claim to fame. Sorry for the digression. There would, therefore, I said, be an art of this turning around, concerned with the way in which this power can most easily and efficiently be turned around, not an art of producing sight in it. Rather, this art takes as given that sight is there, but not rightly turned, nor looking at what it ought to look at, and accomplishes this object. So it seems, he said. Therefore, the other virtues of a soul, as they are called, are probably somewhat close to those of the body, for they are really not there beforehand, and are later produced by habits and exercises, while the virtue of exercising prudence is more than anything somehow more divine. It never loses its power, but according to the way it is turned, it becomes useful and helpful, or again, useless and harmful. Or haven't you yet reflected about the men who are said to be vicious but wise, how shrewdly their petty soul sees, and how sharply it distinguishes those things toward which it is turned, showing that it doesn't have poor vision, although it is compelled to serve vice, so that the sharper it sees, the more evil it accomplishes. Most certainly, he said. And on the theme of sharp seeing and the more evil it accomplishes it. Sorry, I'll say that again. Accomplishes. Put my teeth back in. But this is a haunting picture. This is slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying. Typhoon coming on. It's also known as the slave ship of 1840. And the horrible story behind it is, whilst the slave trade was on active, I think for insurance purposes, if slaves died of illness, you couldn't claim any money back. But if they were lost at sea, you could claim money. So this was slaves being thrown overboard in order to claim on the insurance. And if you look at the bottom right, it's just, again, the vagueness, but it looks like a female form with a chain around her ankle, but also the weirdness of the fish, the weird, and I don't know, it almost looks like a dog on the right, lower right, weird animals that are just very unclear what they are. However, I said, if this part of such a nature were trimmed in earliest childhood, and its ties of kinship with becoming were cut off like leaden weights, which eating and such pleasures, as well as their refinement, naturally attach to the soul and turn its vision downward. If, I say, it were rid of them and turned around toward the true things, the same part of the human beings would also see them most sharply, just as it does those things toward which it now is turned. It's likely, he said. And this is again controversial, because this idea that you could reform people by access to the truth, it's in the I'm trying to think which, in the death camps, the apocryphal story was some of the Nazis listened to Mozart to drown out the noise of the death camp. So the idea that art automatically makes you better, or access to the truth makes you better, is disputable as well. This is the angel standing in the sun, 1846. Just more exposure. And I'll just finish up now with pointing forward to future videos on Turner, because Goethe's theory of light is really, theory of colour is really relevant to what Turner's all about. So the highest degree of light, such as that of the sun, of phosphorus burning in oxygen, is dazzling and colourless. So the light of the fixed stars is for the most part colourless. This light, however, seen through a medium, but very slightly thickened, appears to us yellow. If the density of such a medium be increased, or if its volume become greater, we shall see the light gradually assume a yellow-red hue, which at last deepens to a ruby colour. So this is Goethe's theory of colour, and it absolutely describes what Turner does. So just to quickly give you examples that I'll explore in more detail in future, this ruby colour. This is Venice at sunrise from the Hotel Europa with Campanile of San Marco from 1840. This is a hero of 100 fights. It's basically the Duke of Wellington, a statue being made, a bronze statue, and it's coming out of the foundry where it was forged, but you wouldn't know that. It's so unclear. But obviously the brightness of the forge is expressed. This is sun setting over a lake, 1840. But this, I think that beautifully illustrates the red-yellow analysis of Goethe. This is the scarlet sunset, 1830 to 1840. You know, it's impressionism ahead of its time, if you ask me. This is actually called Light and Colour, Goethe's theory. The morning after the deluge, Moses writing the book of Genesis, 1843. So I really will wind up now. This notion of an atmospheric screen. When I showed you the divided line in Plato, it's this seemingly unproblematic, well, it's not unproblematic, it describes some of the problems, but going from the cave's darkness and the shadows into the bright light, that's the path. And I mentioned earlier, to me, I think Turner dwells in the constant tension between the divided line, going along and back, along and back. So this notion of the atmospheric screen in Turner's painting, something I want to explore in future. So colours, writes Goethe, are actions and passions of the light. They are constantly transforming half-lights or half-shadows that manifest themselves across an intermediary region spanning between the polar opposites of light and darkness, or light and non-light. in a short text entitled Das Triube. This intermediary realm is presented as having a crucial epistemological and ontological significance, since it is in it, according to Goethe, that one finds the first manifestation of space-filling materiality, the first layer of corporeality. So what I actually think Turner achieves more than most other painters, he's actually painting the unpaintable. He's painting this intermediary region spanning between the polar opposites of light and darkness. He's capturing that atmosphere. And to give you a really odd example, this is called Pilate Washing His Hands from 1830. But it's really, to say this is really unclear even if you know the biblical story. So the back of Pontius Pilate is, we're looking at his back, you can tell it's Pontius Pilate because there's a towel in his left hand. But there was a woman with a child on the left of Pontius Pilate, looks like, for argument's sake, a 10, 11-year-old kid, but there's a woman at the back of Pontius Pilate with a younger child. Are these representations of the Virgin Mary at different parts of her life? Christ is on the right. You can only just about make out. You can see the white face, and you can see just to the left a Roman soldier's helmet, and you can just make out Christ is bent over carrying the cross. But it's chaotic. It's, really unclear, a lot of these images. So that's just with higher resolution. So Ruskin defined all this. This is nature. He's describing Turner's work, the exhaustless living energy with which the universe is filled. How various, how transparent, how infinite in its organization. There is a science of the aspects of things. I used the word aspect right at the beginning of the talk, as well as their nature, and it is as much a fact to be noted in their constitution that they produce such and such an effect upon the eye or heart, as they are made up of certain atoms or vibrations of matter. Turner is the master of the science of aspects. And to illustrate that, this is sun setting over a lake, 1840. I think this one's actually one of my favourites. This is sunset off Margate Pier. I'm just giving you examples, hopefully, that will resonate with you as to this notion of portraying the aspect, the science of aspect. This is sunset amid dark clouds over the sea from 1845. This is sunset through dark clouds over the sea, 1823 to 6. The sun's eye there is like the red eye in Terminator, or the cigar in Rear Window, Hitchcock's Rear Window, looking back. And then just to tie all this back up with Plato. So he's gone off to Syracuse with his close friend, maybe lover, Dion. And this is the epitaph on Dion's tomb. And it's all in the murky depths of history, but it's attributed to Plato. And this is the translation. The fates spun out tears as they came into life, for Hecabe and the women of Troy, But Dion, for you and your glorious deeds, the gods poured out hopes for flourishing times. Esteemed all throughout your vast land, you now lie, O Dion, who sparked mad love in my heart. And that made me think, I'll just end with this. I just think it's a brilliant. There's one more image after this, which is just a close-up. But this of this particular painting. This is War, the Exile, and the Rock Limpet, and it was exhibited in 1842. So it's obviously Napoleon, and I'm assuming it's at Saint Exile in Saint Helena. And you can see the ghostly figure of the redcoat guarding him. So for the rest of his life, he's being guarded. There's the red, yellow, there's the setting sun, there's the reflection of Napoleon, but it's at one time the most powerful man in the world, like Alexander the Great, and he's left contemplating this tiny little rock limpet you can see in the middle of this water. But that's the fate that awaits someone who tries to impose their political power over the rest of the world, and this is in some shape or form what happened to Plato himself. Despite this idea that you can go along the divided line and attain the, the, the true ultimate form of good and knowledge, and he himself was distracted by his mad love, as he himself described it, for Dion. And you can almost see Plato in this image of a man contemplating the failure of his own political project. And that, I would argue, is the ultimate glorious failure of the Republic, the book. In its very failure, in its failure to show a realistic political plan that will always work and is the template, Plato does us the service of realizing the unrealistic nature of expecting to achieve the end point of the divided line and achieving ultimate truth, ultimate light, ultimate good. It just doesn't work like that, and I think Turner shows it in all his red, yellow, setting sun glory. So until the next time, all the very best. Take care.